And now let's move on over and talk about Dr. Fauci's funding. According to government documents that we here at the Epoch Times were able to get our hands on, it turns out that 4 prominent scientists, specifically several scientists who played instrumental roles in shaping the public narrative around the natural origins of COVID, well, they received substantial increases in their grant money from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, otherwise known as the NIAID, which is, of course, the agency run by Dr. Anthony Fauci. Meaning that the scientists who actually helped to push the narrative that COVID did not come out of a lab, well, they received substantial increases in the amount of funding that came from Dr. Anthony Fauci's agency. Now, this entire story is a lot like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and with every new piece, we begin to more and more see the full picture. And so let me just briefly set the stage for you. On February 1st of 2020, Dr. Fauci organized a rather secretive teleconference in order to discuss a response to the increasing number of questions that the general public had about the origin of the virus. And on that teleconference, there were 3 prominent scientists, specifically Christian Anderson, Robert Gary, as well as Michael Farzan. And according to emails which were later released under a Freedom of Information Act request, these 3 scientists, during the teleconference, they told Dr. Fauci, as well as the other scientists who were present, that according to their opinion at least, they were between 60 to 80% sure that COVID had leaked from a lab. But here's where things get a little bit weird, because on the very same day that these scientists were explaining to the teleconference attendees that they were between 60 to 80% sure that the virus had come out of a lab, they also completed the first draft of a paper called Proximal Origin. And as you might assume, since during the teleconference, these scientists were saying that the virus had likely come out of a lab, it would make sense that the scientific research paper that they were working on would say the same thing. However, according to newly released emails, which just came out about a week and a half ago, what wound up happening was that the initial draft of this Proximal Origins paper was sent to Dr. Fauci, as well as to his boss, Dr. Francis Collins. And this is where things get very murky, because we as the public, we don't actually know what the original draft of that paper looked like. However, what we do know is that after Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins had a chance to edit the paper, well, it was published in Nature magazine, and that final published version of that study, it promoted the natural origins theory, and it dismissed the lab leak theory. Meaning that somehow, the scientists who claimed on that teleconference that they were 60 to 80% sure that the virus had come from a lab, they published a paper which said the exact opposite, which then naturally leads to the next question. Why exactly did they change their minds? And thus far, that question has not been answered. However, the new piece to the puzzle that we were able to find is that after this Proximal Origins paper was published, these scientists, they got a major bump in the grant money that they got from the NIAID, which of course is the agency that's run by Dr. Anthony Fauci. And besides these 3 scientists, by the way, who were responsible for the Proximal Origins article, well, there was a 4th scientist who received a major bump in funding as well. And that scientist was Dr. Peter Daszak, who runs the EcoHealth Alliance. And if that name sounds familiar to you, well, that might be because previously, Dr. Fauci's agency funded gain-of-function coronavirus research over at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth Alliance. It's amazing how all the pieces start to fit together. Now, let's take a look at the actual funding amounts that these 4 scientists received. And to start with, it's worth noting where this funding was actually coming from. Documents show that on August 27th of the year 2020, the NIAID formally announced a new initiative called the Centers for Research in Emerging Infectious Diseases, otherwise known as CREED or CREID. And according to the agency, this new initiative, it was described as a global network that involves, quote, multidisciplinary investigations into how and where viruses and other pathogens emerge from wildlife and spill over to cause disease in people. And so just to give you a visual picture of how this all breaks down, you have the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health run by Dr. Francis Collins. Under that, you have the NIAID, which is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases run by Dr. Anthony Fauci. And under that, you have this new initiative called CREED, otherwise known as the Centers for Research in Emerging Infectious Diseases. And in terms of the funding, well, Dr. Anthony Fauci's agency provided 11 grants totaling $17 million of new funding in the first year, and then $82 million in total funding spread out across 5 years for this new initiative. Now, one thing that's really notable in terms of the funding is that even though the CREED initiative as a whole was made public on August the 27th, several of these scientists were actually awarded their grant money in May and in June, so several months before the whole thing could actually be scrutinized by the public. And the reason that's so significant will be made clear in a second, so let's dig into the individual grants. So to start with, Mr. Peter Daszak, who is the leader of the EcoHealth Alliance, he was awarded a relatively hefty $7.5 million 5-year grant in order to study emerging diseases in Southeast Asia. And there's something very, you can say, interesting about the timing of his particular grant. Because when you look on the application, on the actual application of the grant, you see that it was awarded, at least the part that says award notice date was on June 17th, 2020. And the reason that is so significant is because back in April of 2020, when the news came to light that Peter Daszak had all these connections to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, well, it was at that time that President Trump actually took the step. He revoked the earlier grant that Peter Daszak had received from the NIAID. And so think about that for a quick moment. In April, when the connections between Peter Daszak and the Wuhan Institute of Virology became public knowledge, President Trump went in and he cut the earlier funding that Daszak had received from Fauci. However, away from the public spotlight, so before the entire initiative was made public, Dr. Fauci, he went ahead, he set up this initiative, and he granted Daszak an additional $7.5 million that was not made public until many months later. So you can say that's some very interesting timing. Now, that grant was set to be disbursed over the course of 5 years. And so thus far, here is what the research has shown. Quote, Peter Daszak received a total of $1.5 million in both 2020 and 2021. Unlike either Anderson or Gary, the other two scientists, proceeds from his CREED grant make up the entirety of his listed NIAID grants in both years. By way of comparison, Daszak had received approximately $662,000 in NIAID grant money in 2019. Put another way, Daszak's post-pandemic funding increased by approximately 130%. And then let's dive into some of the other scientists. For instance, you have Dr. Anderson. He was one of those 4 scientists that we listed. And on January 31st of 2020, he privately, we know this through the emails that have come forward, he privately told Dr. Fauci that the virus looked quote-unquote engineered. And then the very next day, on February the 1st, during that teleconference, he claimed to be 60 to 70% sure that the virus came from a lab. However, he later then recanted his stance and actually worked to spearhead Dr. Fauci's narrative that the virus had a natural origins. And then subsequently, the amount of grant money that he received went up considerably. Here's specifically what the research says in terms of his grant money. Quote, Dr. Anderson received a total of $7.4 million in funding in 2020 as compared to $4.5 million in grant proceeds in 2019. Anderson's total grant funding increased to nearly $9 million in 2021. The new CREED grants, co-awarded with Gary, which is another scientist, accounted for approximately $1.9 million of his 2020 grant proceeds and $2 million of his grant proceeds in 2021. And so then let's actually get into Dr. Gary as well. During the teleconference on February 1st, he said that, quote, he really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you can get from the bat virus to SARS-CoV-2. And then he further cited the remarkable sequences of mutations that would have to occur for SARS-CoV-2 to naturally arise, telling the group, quote, I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature. And then furthermore, Dr. Gary noted that a lab-created virus would easily explain the virus data that he was seeing, and he told the group that, quote, in the lab, it would be easy to generate the perfect 12-base insert that you wanted. Furthermore, Dr. Gary, who is one of the co-authors of the Proximal Origins theory paper, he was once interviewed by The Intercept, which is a pretty good publication, and he stated specifically that he was advised during that teleconference to not discuss a lab leak when writing the Proximal Origin paper. Here's specifically what he told The Intercept, quote, the major feedback we got from the February 1st teleconference was 1, don't try to write a paper at all. It's unnecessary. Or 2, if you do write a paper, don't mention a lab origin, as that will just add fuel to the conspiracists. And indeed, not only does it appear that that's exactly what they did, but also it looks like Dr. Gary suddenly received a boon of funding afterwards. Specifically, according to the documents that we were able to peruse, Dr. Gary received, quote, $7 million in NIAID grants in 2020 as compared to $5.7 million in 2019. Gary also received $6.6 million in grants in 2021. The new CREED grant, co-awarded with Dr. Anderson, accounted for approximately $1.9 million of his 2020 grant proceeds and $1.8 million of his grant proceeds in 2021. And then lastly, you have Mr. Michael Farzan, who likewise changed his views from believing that the virus came from a lab to then later saying that he agrees with the notion that it came from some kind of recombination between a bat and a pangolin. And he likewise was granted a significant amount of funding afterwards. Here is what the research showed that Mr. Farzan got. Quote, Michael Farzan received $9.9 million in grants from Fauci's NIAID in 2020, followed by another $7.9 million in 2021, and an additional $919,000 at the start of 2022. By comparison, Farzan had received $3.8 million in grant money from NIAID in 2019. Although Farzan received substantial increases in grant funding, none of that money appears to have come under grants provided by the CREED initiative. Now, I think it relatively goes without saying, at least at this point, that there's no real known connection between these scientists pushing the natural origins theory and then getting such a large increase in the amount of funding that they were granted from Dr. Fauci's agency or from that sub-initiative under his agency. However, these documents, they do raise, you can say, sort of the natural and obvious question, which is, out of the many thousands of scientists who would be very interested in this grant money, I mean, think about it, that's 11 grants totaling what? That's 11 grants totaling $83 million from this CREED initiative. How is it that 3 of the individuals who were chosen happen to be the same people who are promoting Dr. Fauci's natural origins theory, as well as, of course, Dr. Peter Daszak, who had all those connections to the Wuhan Institute of Virology? That is, it's interesting. You know what? At the very least, what it does is, even though the connections aren't exactly clear, nothing has been laid to bear yet, these documents do offer at least another piece of the puzzle that can give us a clearer picture on what is actually happening behind the scenes. Now, that is thus far all we know. And so, I don't want to speculate. I just want to present you with the facts, and then you can make up your own mind as to what you believe. And now, let's head back to the studio. If you'd like to read more about this Dr. Fauci funding, or more generally about how this whole natural origins narrative came to be, well, I'll throw the links to several articles into the description box below this video for you to check out. If you'd like to go deeper into the story, I would recommend that you check them all out. And all I ask in return is that while you're down there looking for those links, take a quick detour and smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. And then lastly, if you happen to have a Telegram account, consider following us at FactsMatter_Roman, who publishes links to all of our episodes there. So if anything ever does happen here on YouTube, you can always find the links on Telegram. And then until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed and stay free.